A part of Russia's threat to Ukraine is ongoing cyber attacks on its key infrastructure and services. In the past week, ASIO's Director General, Mike Burgess, has warned about the risk of interference in the coming federal election. Alastair MacGibbon is the Chief Strategy Officer of CyberCX and is also the former head of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. He was also the Prime Minister's Special Advisor on cybersecurity. I caught up with him in Hobart this week to ask him about the current threats to Australian business.
Well, there's no doubt that cybersecurity risk is near the top of all the risk registers of public and private sector entities these days, Ross. That's generally. There's no doubt that as geopolitical tensions rise, that cybersecurity goes higher on the agenda. We know that the state of Russia will use cyber means against the Ukraine. We've seen them do this before, both against the Ukraine and other neighbouring states during territorial disputes. Let me just say this, though. I think it's extremely unlikely that Australia would be a direct target of Russia, as some people would say. But there's always a chance when someone uses cyber means. The Russians in 2017 were behind the NotPetya global ransomware campaign. That was the state of Russia taking action against the Ukraine, and that spread laterally globally and affected critical infrastructure organisations all around the world. So when cyber means are used against one country, it can spill over. I just don't think we're going to be a direct target. But every time there's tensions, of course, cyber means are on the agenda for nations, and therefore it is an increased threat, there's no doubt.
So what about the forthcoming election here? Does that also pose a potential risk in terms of interference to institutions and indeed even the election itself this year?
Well, the greatest institution we have in this country is our democracy. It's the thing that we should protect most wholeheartedly as a nation, and there's no doubt that cyber means, whether it's nation states wanting to do misinformation or disinformation, as we've seen them do in other countries, there's no doubt that that could happen in Australia, and we've heard Australian institutions like ASIO and others talk about how they'll look to protect our democracy against people that will use cyber means to spread misinformation, disinformation. And then, of course, you have the direct hacking concept into institutions like the Electoral Commission. There's no doubt that you will see an increased security posture by federal agencies to protect an election. Australians should be the ones that determine the outcome of elections. How they vote is their choice, but what we don't want is foreign nations influencing that. So there's no doubt, again, that is a heightened concern for any organisation that's involved in our great and complex democracy.
So while you say that Australian companies have cybersecurity as one of their highest priorities, as you go through many of these companies, how do you rate their preparedness for these sort of attacks?
Well, I've been in this space for a long time, and over the last 20 years of talking to boards and CEOs and others of public and private sector entities, I've certainly seen boards be more engaged, much more interested, asking more probing questions. Of course, there are greater obligations upon directors and officers these days, and the federal government has flagged even more coming. So they're really keenly interested at the executive and the director level of organisations. That's a good thing because it puts pressure on cybersecurity experts and organisations, not just to list the technologies that they've been buying, but how those technologies and the services around them are actually reducing risk. And then, most importantly, Ross, what the residual risks are in those organisations so organisations can plan. The thing about cybersecurity is you prevent as much as you can, and then you want to monitor really quickly for the risk that is inevitable to occur from time to time, and then react really quickly to reduce harm. That's the type of language that boards are now using. So look, there's always work to do. You never hang up a mission accomplished sign when it comes to cybersecurity. But I would say generally, in public and private sector entities I deal with, I've seen an increasing maturation, and that's a good thing for all of us because we rely upon these technologies for our daily lives.
So let's say if you think about the electricity grid, the gas network, telecommunications, these are obvious areas that might be the subject of attack that would influence people's everyday lives. I just wonder, though, going down the chain, whether other businesses underestimate their strategic importance to their customers or others that might be disrupted by a cybersecurity attack.
Yeah, Ross, there's no doubt, of course, we now know that every single thing we do in our lives, our livelihoods, and frankly, even just the very functioning of our society is about connected devices and computers now. Water, power, transport, banking. Everything that we do is connected, and therefore cyber risk is very high on those agendas. And you're right, I think for a long time individual organisations have made those risk decisions rather than recognising what role they play in society. The federal government has moved and passed some legislation recently which will increase the obligations upon critical infrastructure providers in critical infrastructure sectors. It's broadened that definition. That's a good thing because you're not just a company, you're a utility that we rely upon. That's a good thing if those obligations increase, and all those providers I speak to just want a level playing field. They want to know what their obligations are, and they'll lift to those things. That's a wise and prudent move that we've seen in Australia, and I must say Australia is one of the leading nations there in actually looking at the role critical infrastructure plays. I think for a long time we have underestimated the cyber threat, and organisations though are lifting pretty fast to address that threat and risk.
Now, one thing that's always been true, and that is the ability for cyber criminals to adapt, to become smarter in getting into systems without being detected. Do you think this is an ever-evolving thing, that the technology gets better, so the crooks get better, but the defences of companies have to constantly improve as well?
Well, firstly, let me say I'm really glad you've raised criminals, because we often just think about nation states, but one of the biggest threats we face is criminals. They build harm into their business models, so they actually want to do harm to us, and that's how they monetize themselves. So there are hundreds, if not thousands, of businesses out there each year affected by ransomware, which is where criminals cause extraordinary harm and demand payment to reduce some of that harm. And you can't ever trust a crook, Ross, so that's part of the problem with that model. But look, you're right. What was safe yesterday, you could wake up this morning to find that there's a new vulnerability that wasn't known that suddenly makes things unsafe. Criminals and nation states innovate all the time when it comes to these technologies, and because they're complex technologies, we find vulnerabilities that we didn't know existed. Those two factors combined increase the threat surface and the risk that all organisations face.
Alastair MacGibbon, always great to have a chat with you, and I appreciate your time today.